This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics, reviews of Hasib and the Queen of Serpents and Moonface. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Pascal. And we are two guys with advanced degrees talking about comics in translation.
That's right. And on the July episode, Pascal and I are going to look at two really fascinating works. We're going to begin with David Bay's Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, A Tale of 1001 Nights. And then after that, we're going to look at Moonface by Alejandro Jodorowsky and Faceis Boucq. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by those fine folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And in this month's previews, if you go to the NBM page, that is a publisher of the Hasib book we're going to discuss, you can find a Dungeon Twilight complete set, the 4 volumes for only $34.99. This is by Johan Sfar and Louis Trondheim, two leaders of the new comics in France, just like our friend David Bay here, who did the book we're going to discuss. And as far as Humanoids is concerned, the publisher of Moonface, this month they have a book in translation as well called Halloween Tales, written by Olivier Boiscomin and Denis Pierre-Filippini, with art by Olivier Boiscomin. A nice seasonal book. It comes out in October.
That's right. You know, you really can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service, whether it's titles in translation or otherwise. It's a great place to get your comics. Go to dcbservice.com because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Pascal and Derek sent you.
Exactly.
Pascal, now, technically, this is our July episode of the Eurocomics series, although it won't be going up until the first days of August.
It's the late July episode.
Very late July episode. And that's actually on me. I, as listeners may recall, I've been having problems with my father and his health over the past year. And something kind of came up in July that caused me to really divert my attention, which meant that especially some of the monthly episodes, webcomics, and this one, I think in particular, we're recording later than we normally do. But we are getting a July show in, and we do plan on an August show. So this one will go up the first days of August, so I guess our listeners will get a double shot of the Eurocomics series in the month of August.
Exactly. So that would be a good opportunity to do a lot of listening during August. Maybe people were just having a relaxing time during July anyway.
Yeah.
And not worrying about comics alternative. But we are back. Twice.
We're back.
Mm-hmm.
And being back, let's go ahead and get started with this month's or July's titles. And we're going to begin with Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, A Tale of 1001 Nights. and this is by David Bay, or for those who want to pronounce it in an American way, David B. It came out on June 1st from NBM, and it is one of the tales that Scheherazade tells in the actual Thousand and One Night collection, or the text Thousand and One Nights. And maybe a way to start, Pascal, is by, I guess, a two-part question I have for you. Have you read 1001 Nights? And then, whether you have or not, why do you think that David Bay chose to adapt the story of the Queen of Serpents instead of other stories that Scheherazade tells?
Well, I've heard, of course, of the tales, but I've never actually read the text itself. So I knew the principle of how it's organized, but never really read any of the narratives themselves. So it was a first for me. As far as your second question, I think one of the reasons we have this book, it's because of its publishing history in France. It's actually part of a specific collection in the Gallimard catalog, the big French publisher. And they have a graphic novel collection called Faceis. And I believe it's overseen by Sfar, but I could be wrong on that one. He's always over a lot of different collections, and he's so big, Johann Sfar. But the principle of the collection is they revisit a piece of literature that was published by Gallimard previously in comic book form. So they're all adaptations. Mm-hmm. So there is like Camus, there is Colette, there is Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince, a lot of authors, not necessarily French. So I'm guessing they approached David Bay and asked him if he wanted to adapt a text that was in the Gallimard catalog, and that's what he went for. Which is a little different from the other ones. I was looking at the French Gallimard website. The other one, well, actually, no, there is Tristan and Isolde, which is Isolde. Is that what you say in English? Tristan and Isolde? Is that right? The medieval text. Tristan and Isolde. Is that right?
I guess so, yeah.
So that would be kind of a text like the 1001 Nights, which is more of a traditional text compared to more recent stuff. But yeah, that's probably what happened in terms of that. Now, why he picked that in particular, I think if you remember in Epileptic, his big autobiography.
That's right. The serpents become important.
Correct.
In Epileptic. I didn't even think about that. I'm glad that you brought that up.
And also, as a child, he talks about being fascinated with drawing those very intricate battles with different forces fighting all the time, almost like murals. And you can see that. I think this story lends itself to those the different factions fighting with monsters and animals. But the serpent motif, is in Epileptic.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad you brought up Epileptic, and I'm familiar with Epileptic, but I didn't even think about the significance of serpents, and also along with that, I guess, the battle scenes that are a part of that, because you're right, those are also at the core of Hasib and the Queen of Serpents. Mm-hmm. So it would make sense that of all the tales that Scheherazade tells, that this would be one that David Bay maybe gravitates toward, just given its subject matter.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good guess. But unless sometimes it's just the publisher that went, you do this. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be something as mundane as that. Mm-hmm. One thing that you mentioned is, I guess, the design of Epileptic, and then equating that or linking that with the visual design that we have in Hasib and the Queen of Serpents. I have to say, and we didn't plan it this way, But not only the David Bay book, but the same thing with Moonface that we'll discuss in a little bit. We chose two beautiful texts.
Yes.
I mean, absolutely gorgeous in terms of the art. And even though Francois Boucq is a very different kind of artist from David Bay, I mean, both really stand out. And one of the things that I found, I guess there are two things for me that are outstanding when it comes to Hasib and the Queen of Serpents is, well, first, the visual design. So you will find, as Scheherazade is telling the tale, or other characters are telling their stories, many times the visuals will be laid out not so much realistically, but in a fantastical way, sometimes in a way that suggests a design. And I think it's just beautifully rendered, the way that David Bay illustrates. Another thing that really stands out to me with Hasib and the Queen of Serpents is the vibrant colors.
Yeah.
I mean, they just really leap out at you in ways that are significantly different from almost any other comic that I've read lately. They're just really bright and eye-catching. I can't see someone picking up Hasib and the Queen of Serpents and not being moved.
Yeah, definitely. It has, and it's interesting because David Bay is famous because of Epileptic and other works for amazing control of black and white drawing, and then seeing his work in color. We've seen other examples, but this one really stands out in terms of the colors and helping the composition. It's not just colored. It's really, even though the colors are simple, flat colors, they are chosen in a way that really, I think, drives the story, makes it very appealing. And one other thing I forgot to mention about this, the context of its publication in France, it's that this collection is part of the young adult series in Gallimard's catalog. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, so the audience is really to maybe, I would say, age 13 and up, but to get young young people, to expose them to like literary texts through comics. I think that's what they were going for. So that's another, I think, interesting aspects of this, because definitely it can be read and enjoyed by adults. But I noticed this at the beginning in the copyright information that it said Gallimard Jeunesse, youth, and I was like, oh really? This is for young people? And then when I read it, it's like, yeah, that works. I can see it. I can see that. I would say teens reading that would be, I think it would be interesting. All the monsters and stuff is exciting. So,
and it's interesting. I mean, David Bay, as significant a creator as he is, we haven't discussed him a lot on the Comics Alternative. I think we've discussed several of his texts before. I know we did review at one point. It may have been, I can't remember if it was the first or the second volume of his Best of Enemies series, the history of U.S. and Middle East relations. But again, I can't remember if that was part one or part two. And it seems to me we've discussed maybe one or two other David Bay books. But he just seems like someone that we should be discussing more on the show.
Yeah, and he's got a pretty big output, but I think not everything has been translated yet. Because there's maybe half a dozen books available in English, probably.
Yeah.
His collection of dreams and things like that.
Yeah. Oh, we did. Okay. Yes, we did. I just remembered. We discussed both Black Paths and Incidents in the Night.
Okay. I say
number one. So
I remember listening to that episode actually.
Yeah. So I guess we've discussed it more than I thought we did. That's good. Yeah,
and he actually was in Toronto in TCAF this year to promote this. Yeah. For this publication, I think it was maybe the debut. The preview debut. Yeah.
Huh. Cool. Okay, so one of the things that really stands out in this collection, in addition to what we've already mentioned, right? The design, the color, all of that. And this gets to the heart of what 1001 Nights is all about, is embedded narratives. Because this book in particular, but 1001 Nights in general, in many ways is a text about storytelling. And for those who may not be familiar, I mean, the basis of 1001 Nights is that a prince is going to kill Scheherazade, but Scheherazade says, "Let me tell you a story before you execute me." And what she does to extend her life is to tell one story after another that just completely mesmerizes the prince. And, that's how this book, Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, begins. On the very first page, we see a naked, although we don't see any naughty bits, Scheherazade talking with, the king. Yeah, the king, beginning to tell the story of the Queen of Serpents, and starts talking about Hasib's father, Daniel, who is a scholar, and then it just goes from there. Every now and again in this volume, Hasib and the Queen of Serpents by David Bay, we see Scheherazade and the king in the middle of their discourse.
Yeah, and
they pop in every now and again, but not often.
And we should mention that this first page, in terms of design, is quite amazing. Because they are literally, the two characters, Scheherazade and the prince, are literally drawn in a circle around the main character. I mean, the character she's talking about. It's like
their bodies are framing the narrative, so to speak.
Exactly, and in a loop, which is kind of the theme of the serpent biting its own tail throughout the story, as every story contains another story, and we go in that, and that story contains another story. Everything is embedded, so we never get out of the story.
Right, yeah, and that gets back to what I was saying earlier, that 1001 Nights is about storytelling as an act.
Yeah.
And so you get stories about stories about stories. And we do have a series of embedded narratives. So over the course of Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, Hasib is trapped in this underground chamber. The lumberjacks that he works with got a little greedy with this honey that they discover, and they think that Hasib is going to want a cut because he was the one who actually found the honey. So what they do is they trap him inside of this cavern, and so Hasib finds his way through the cavern to this really open space, and that's where he meets the Queen of Serpents. And so he tells the Queen of Serpents what happened to him. In other words, he tells her the story. Now, we don't get his recap of the story because we've just been reading what happened to him. But then the Queen of Serpents says, "Thank you for telling me and sharing with me your story, Hasib. Now let me reciprocate, so to speak, and tell you a story that's based on my life." And so this is where the narratives begin being embedded. So we have the Queen of Serpents who is telling the story to Hasib, and her main story, or at least the first part of the story, is about this young king, Bulukia.
Bulukia.
Yeah,
Bulukia.
Is that how you pronounce it? Okay,
I don't know. My best guess.
Okay.
Bulukia, yeah.
Okay, so Bulukia, we get his story that involves, of all people, King Solomon. In fact, Solomon makes an appearance in a number of these narratives. And then Bulukia comes across another character called Zanshaw, Prince Zanshaw. And then Zanshaw tells Bulukia his story about what he went through, also involving King Solomon, but most prominently the love of his life, Shamsa. And then we go back to Bulukia's story, and then we go from Bulukia's story back to the Queen of Serpents in her story to Hasib, and then we're back with Hasib and what goes on with him. So I think that is the most embedded in terms of narrative that things get. And that takes up, I think, the majority of the book. The Queen's story to Hasib, which is about Boucq, and then Janshah's story to Boucq. That's most of the text.
Yeah, and actually in France it was published in 2 volumes, and the one volume was about 60 pages, and the second volume was only 46. And I was reading the reviews when it came out in France. People were a little disappointed by the second part because it felt kind of skinny. And I think it's much better to actually publish them as one book. It would feel a little. I guess it gives you the experience of the narrative stopping, and then you have to wait for the next day to get the next story, like with Scheherazade. But it would be difficult to break it into 2 volumes. I think to just say
where did it break in the French?
So it's a 60-page book. So I'm guessing around probably page 64, 65 of our edition, because that's where we have Scheherazade appears, and she talks about Janshah. So it was the 491st night.
Yes.
One thing we should mention is that throughout the narrative, there are little inserts, and sometimes sometimes there are speech balloons that will pop up as the voice of Scheherazade, I guess, maybe, saying, and it was, and then we get the number of the night. So 495th night, 486th night. And so we can see what little piece of story she told that night, where it ends, where it starts. And I thought that was kind of a nice little touch that throughout the book. And sometimes it's like a scroll that he draws a little piece of paper that's floating in one of the panels, like on page 11. There's this little scroll floating in the panel. Sometimes it's a side character who has a speech balloon that says that. So it's a nice way to kind of bring us back to, okay, this is a story that is told, kind of as a reminder. The only little issue I had is that, I don't know if you noticed on page 11, there's a typo. It says 404th night.
I noticed that. I thought, wow, so they go from 404th night to, I can't remember what the
85th
night.
Yeah,
it's like they jumped really ahead. So you say that's probably just a typo.
Yeah, I think it's the 8 that was turned into a 0 by mistake, because the one before is 483rd, and then 404, and then 485th. So, and I thought, are they going backwards? And no.
Yeah. Editor didn't catch that.
Yeah, so maybe the second edition they will fix that.
Well, also that's David Bay's way of, I guess, trying to be true to the original text, because in the original story of the Queen of the Serpents, I mean, there is in Thousand and One Nights, I mean, there is that, when it was the 483rd night, when it was the 485th night, so on and so forth. So there's that as well. But it's interesting in that I think had David Bay made the choice to cut out those references to the various nights, I don't know if the story would change at all. I think it would still stand on its own without that. But he chose, I guess, to be truer to the original text and to include those references to what night this part of the story is being told on.
Yeah, and I like the way it is really integrated in the visual narrative. Like on page 59, you see these different monsters. They're monsters fighting the monkey people, and each monster is saying one of the words. And it was the 419th night. So I like this little playfulness with this idea, so you never know what's going to be, how it's going to be rendered.
Right, and that gets back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the design of this text. And in fact, if you turn the page to 60, you have yet another example of David Bey's use of design and how it functions as a storytelling device. Because, as you point out, this is when, I guess, the monsters are fighting the monkey people, the apes. And in order to show, I guess, the entanglements that's going on during this battle, on page 60, not the entire page, but most of it, you see this kind of spiral of figures, monsters and monkeys, as they're fighting. And it kind of just turns in on itself in a way that suggests a kind of chaos. And I really appreciated that. And there are a lot of these touches throughout the text.
And it seems to be, he's always borrowing from different visual traditions. Like this reminds me a little bit of pre-Columbian art, the way the characters are kind of close together, always most of them are in profile. And it becomes like a little fresco or something you could imagine on the side of a building or something that would be carved. It's really, really cool looking.
Right, and you get something somewhat similar on page 99 when we have the Queen of Serpents and Hafan, who I guess is the villain of this tale or this narrative. And when Hafan asks or tells Hasib to take him to the Queen of Serpents, and he's going underground, and you can see that the path that they're taking is kind of almost spiraling. And we don't see the entire spiral because in the middle of the page is a series of 3 horizontal panels where Hafan actually does meet the Queen of Serpents.
Yeah, you have another example, page 92, where you see Hasib escaping from this chamber where he was with the Queen of Serpents, following another serpent. And there's a playfulness to it that I think, as I was thinking about the audience, being younger readers, I know that as a child reading comics, sometimes I would just, a page like that would just stop and just look at every detail and, follow along. Like, where is he going to take me? Because it's just a fun, playful thing, like find your way in this maze type design.
Yeah,
it's really cool.
And, you mentioned at the very beginning of this text when we had Scheherazade telling the tale or beginning to tell the tale to the king, and how they or their bodies are framing the narrative that Scheherazade is telling, which is in the middle of them. You have the exact same thing going on in, I think, pages you've already referenced, 64 and 65. We have 2 pages where Scheherazade is talking to the king, and we see both of them. And in both instances, their bodies are forming a frame. And so that frame becomes, in essence, a narrative frame to the story that Scheherazade is telling, which is in the middle of the king and Scheherazade.
Yeah. This is a very interesting design.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book in terms of design and story, and also a great example of adaptation.
Definitely. There's a when the story begins and we are introduced to Hasib's father, and he wants a son, so he has a story of his own where he loses all his books except for 5 pages that he buries in a chest, and then he tells his wife that so she's expecting, and so Hasib will be born, he says, you will give him the 5 pages in the chest. Once he has read and understood the pages, he will be the wisest man of his time. So it's kind of an important plot point. It's when then he dies and Hasib is born, and then we get the Hasib story. What was surprising to me is that she never goes back to this in the entire book, right? There's no
To his father, Daniel?
To the pages in the chest.
To the pages, yes. Although, in a way, she does come back to what Daniel, Hasib's father, mentions about him being wise when, I don't know if this is necessarily a spoiler, I don't think it is, when Hasib at the very end becomes, the Visner?
Yes, the Vizier, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Vizier. So he does achieve that kind of, I guess, sage or wise status that his father anticipated. Although you are right, we don't get a reference to those 5 pages, all that's left from his books.
And at first I was kind of confused about this, but I'm thinking it's probably one of Scheherazade's strategies to kind of tease, the prince with plot points that she might pick up or not. And maybe if at some point he says, well, you never told me about the chess. Well, wait a minute. Now I'm going to tell you, right? So I feel that there's
a way of extending her life.
Exactly. Manipulating our audience that way, making sure she always has a door to open and another story can come out of it. And then so this was page 8 at the very beginning. On page 9, we get this interesting panel where we see basically Hasib growing up from being a baby to a young man in one panel. So sometimes she'll accelerate the story, and so sometimes she'll slow it down according to what she wants to get at. Mm-hmm. But I thought that was interesting. And so you can see the character aging in the same panel.
Right. And even though the basis of the text is the character Hasib, mm-hmm. As we mentioned, with these various embedded narratives at different places within the text, you will have other characters that take the fore, right? Mm-hmm. So for a good chunk of the book, Boucq is the one who is the protagonist because we basically get his story, which is the story that the Serpent Queen is telling Hasib. Then in another place in the text, the main figure is Jansaw because Jansaw is telling Boucq his story, and that story is being told by the Queen to Hasib. So even though we may not see Hasib, he is nonetheless a part of the narrative, even when he's absent, because he is the listener. He is the audience.
Yes. He's kind of the prince himself, in a way. She's almost, reproducing. She's the serpent as well, so the, in a way, the Queen of Serpents and Scheherazade are the same.
Yeah, in many ways they are, yeah. And in fact, the way that, we were mentioning that Scheherazade and the king kind of use their bodies as frames to the story that's being told, the way that Scheherazade especially, I think, bends, which seems unnatural, it's not unlike the windiness of the serpent.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I can't say enough about Hasib and the Queen of Serpents. This is just a fascinating text.
Yeah, it is.
Beautifully rendered, a great example of adaptation and storytelling.
Yeah, highly recommended. And thank you, NBM, for bringing it to English. Oh, we forgot to mention Montana Kane, the translator. Who is going to be our segue, I guess.
Yes, that's a good point. So Montana Kane is the translator of Hasib and the Queen of Serpents. She is also, and I'm assuming it's a she, the translator of the next text that we're going to be discussing for this month, and that is Moonface. Correct. This is written by Alejandro Jodorowsky with art by Francois Boucq, and this is a Humanoids publication. This came out on June 27th.
Yes.
And so, Montana Kane is the translator of this text as well. And by the way, you and I didn't plan this. We didn't say, hey, let's choose 2 books by the same translator. We knew we wanted to do Moonface. We knew we wanted to do Hasib and the Queen of Serpents. It was just luck, I guess, that they both were translated by Montana Kane. Now, this is not the first time that we have discussed Jodorowsky and Boucq together on the podcast. I guess it was about a year and a half ago that we, Edward and I, discussed Bouncer.
Yes.
The Western, which also was written by Jodorowsky with art by Francois Boucq. And, just a wonderful text. And this is also wonderful, although very different. We've also talked about Boucq's work with... Jerome
Charyn, probably.
Yes.
Tulip.
Like The Magician's Wife, Little Tulip.
Little Tulip,
Yeah. So, we've discussed Boucq on the show, I guess, more than Jodorowsky. But, we did discuss both of them together when we did the discussion of Bouncer. This is a very different book. Now, Bouncer, beautifully rendered, was, I would say, a more... Have you read Bouncer?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah. It's a more traditional narrative, albeit it's the Western genre. But what I mean by more traditional narrative in that there seems to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. In other words, there seems to be some kind of narrative trajectory that Jodorowsky had in mind. I don't know if I can say the same thing about Moonface.
Yeah, and Moonface is actually their first collaboration.
Oh, really? So they did this before Bouncer?
Yes. So Moonface has been, it was published in 3 volumes originally. Yes. And over a long period of time. So the first chapter, which is, there are chapter divisions in the Humanoids publication, so you can see it's about 100 pages. And that was published in 1992, which is almost 10 years before the first volume of Bouncer came out. And then the second episode, called the Zenith Stone, La Pierre de Fête in French, came out in 2001. In 97, I'm sorry. So 5 years later, another 86 pages, which is not unusual for this type of books. French publication rhythm is much slower than in the US. So waiting 5 years for a book, it's long, but it's not unheard of. We can live with that, especially when it's Boucq, because he delivers, but it takes a long time to put together. And then the third volume came out in 2004.
Wow.
So 7 years. So it took 12 years.
So that's
to
chapter
complete.
3, The Egg of the Soul?
Yes. L'oeuvre de l'âme, yeah. And I was, and so it's kind of interesting for me because I actually had read the first 2 volumes, but never read the third because I left France and I kind of lost track because 7 years, I moved on to something else. So it was interesting to read the whole thing as one volume. And I think it's quite interesting to see how Boucq kept is it's very you can't tell that so much time has passed. His style is very stable. The colors, it feels of one piece, not. But in the meantime, he was also doing Bouncer because that started in 2001. So he was doing several types of book at the same time, plus his own solo work that I don't think has not been translated yet, when it's Boucq writing his own stuff. And when the first chapter came out, The Invisible Cathedral, I remember it was quite an event. It was Boucq and Jodorowsky together, Jodorowsky is the Incal, that's why, and of course the movie maker who made all those cult movies. But in the world of Franco-Belgian comics, Jodorowsky is kind of a legend because of the Incal, with Mobius, which was a major works in the 80s. and we knew of his kind of crazy ideas and concepts. And then Boucq's solo work is also quite surreal. He's famous for the adventures of Jérôme Mouchereau, who is insurance salesman, but he lives in a jungle. It's very difficult to describe. So it's like the world exists in the jungle with animals, and but he has a suit and he's selling insurance. It's very surreal. It's the graphics are very interesting and with a lot of very realistic and very cartoony at the same time. It's this strange mix. We can see that in Moonface. Like there's an exaggeration to kind of a caricature to some of his characters, but the settings can be fantastical, but can also be very realistic. The way he draws minerals and vegetation or the natural world, animals is so true. I think there is. So anyway, that was kind of a little background.
Yeah. Now it's interesting, and I guess it makes sense that this was originally published in 3 volumes in France, because what you and I are discussing is the Humanoids Deluxe Edition, right? Which is in hard copy. Really, and I actually happened to get the actual hard copy because I just wanted a copy of it, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's something that it's heavy, nice hard copy, but it's wonderful to hold and to look at. Although I did find on Amazon and Kindle or Comixology that I guess when Humanoids released this nice hardbound deluxe edition, the complete Moonface, they also released Moonface on Comixology in digital format, but they did so in 5 volumes. So not 3 volumes, but 5 volumes.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed that. And it looks like they divided the first chapter into 2 different volumes, the Wave Tamer and then the Invisible Cathedral. And then I think that the second chapter is divided into 2 others, the Zenith Stone and the Woman from the Sky. And then the 5th volume is this last chapter that we get, the 3rd one in the deluxe edition, The Egg of the Soul.
Yeah, I guess because it would be 5 about 50-page volumes.
Yes, it's about 50, 58, something like that pages. So,
and it makes the publication history even more complicated because in France it was 3 volumes, but there is also another edition in France in 4 volumes. So you can 1 in 4, and it's crazy. And I don't see interestingly enough, I don't see a 1-volume edition because that's odd because of the French. It's kind of a tradition in France to do those 1-volume. When you have like a series in 4 or 5 or 6, they'll put everything in one big, fat, beautiful volume, and then especially around Christmas time, they're all over bookstores. They're a huge thing. So I don't know, maybe they never did that. But
we have it in English now.
Yeah. One other thing is that in France, it's published by Casterman, not the Humanoids. So there must have been some kind of transaction so the Humanoids can publish the English version.
Well, I mean, Humanoids has been publishing, I think, most of Jodorowsky's work in English.
Yeah, but most of Jodorowsky's work is published by Humanoids in France.
Oh, in France as well. Okay.
Yeah, except this was not, because this was Casterman, and I believe it was part of the À Suivre magazine, which was a main comic book magazine in that, like the 80s and 90s in France. Casterman one. So Casterman has a different reputation compared to Humanoids, more serious. So this was kind of a wacky Casterman publication because it's a little off. So let's dig into the story. What is this all about?
Yeah, well, you mentioned wackiness, and I think that goes a long way of describing what goes on in Moonface. Now, the titular character, who is, I guess, arguably the protagonist of this narrative, he also goes by the name Barado.
Yeah,
or at least that's what Isha calls him. And Isha is another major character in the text. She's actually the one who, I guess, so to speak, takes Moonface or Barado under her wing and tries to care for him and to watch out for him, even though apparently Moonface doesn't need to be watched after because he can handle things on his own.
Yes.
He is this kind of an innocent. He's mute, but he has these unusual powers that influence not just humans, but especially the natural world. Because the setting we get, we're on some kind of, I guess it's an island nation. And it's one that has a problem growing its own food. And so they have to import food through trade with neighboring nations. But one of the things that marks this island nation is it's a world that's plagued by these gigantic tidal waves. And so the book Moonface begins with the tidal wave alarm going off and everybody getting inside or trying to find cover because this gigantic wave is expected to hit them any minute. And this happens several times throughout the text. Now, Moonface doesn't really take shelter, but what he does, and this is, I think, when we first get a sense of his unusual powers, he seems to command the waves to bypass him, and he does so through what it looks like some kind of dance that he performs. And so he moves in what seems like a very poetic ballet type manner, in a way that bends the elements to him or around him to where he's not affected. And this happens with waves. This happens with, let's say, when we have rocks coming down like an avalanche. Every now and again, when we have glass broken, he does what he does in order to command the elements to not only avoid him, but many times to take shape. There's one scene in the book, and I think it's in the second chapter, where we get, he's building this cathedral again. Bezaleel, who's the priest at this cathedral, which is basically in ruins when we first see it. But then when Moonface gets there, he tends to build it back up. And at one point, I think the army forces that are after Moonface and the others, as rebels, they, I guess, are firing on the cathedral. And as a result, I guess the material that they're firing turns to glass. And what Moonface does is when the glass is shattered, he, so to speak, commands the glass to take the shape of this mosaic.
Stained glass, yeah.
So, it becomes like stained glass for this cathedral, which is something that the priest, Bezaleel, says that the cathedral needs. Yeah.
So, I guess we didn't establish the context of the island. So, you mentioned that people on the island, there's a shortage of food. They cannot grow their own food. However, they have a source of energy that I guess they trade, but that is also poisoning the environment, some kind of radioactive compound.
That's right.
And it is, from the first pages, we're thrown into really the politics of the island and who is in power and what kind of government is controlling. And it looks like some kind of monarchic fascist regime with a religious group that is kind of pulling the strings behind a very kind of ridiculous leader and his wife, who is always very worried about his hemorrhoids, right? So from the first page, this is Jodorowsky. Now,
In fact, this leader, whose real name is Oscar Lazo, and his wife is Lily, but he's called the conductor.
Yes.
Not conductor, but conductor. At least that's the way it seems to be pronounced.
Enhancing the ridiculousness of it.
Right. And he's an egg farmer, and he comes to this community, and that's how he eventually comes to power. And then so this regime is marked by eggs as an icon. So there are egg-shaped buildings, there are references to eggs, although ironically, Oscar, the conductor, hates eating eggs. He's tired of eggs. And at the beginning, when we see him, he's being served eggs, and he's really pissed off.
Yes. So it's an ovarian regime. That's what they call it.
Yes.
Now, one thing I want to point out, because we can't really... Every time you read Jodorowsky, and it can become a problem sometimes. You cannot avoid hearing the echo of Dune by Frank Herbert. It's very famous that he tried to put together a movie adaptation in the 70s that should have been this crazy thing. There's a documentary about it that I highly recommend. If you are not familiar with Jodorowsky, it's an interesting introduction to the character. He's definitely a very colorful and interesting person. I don't know if I want him to be my neighbor, but he's he's quite something. And then he was so taken by this project, and I think the impact of reading Dune on his imagination that was already very fertile and interesting. And there are tropes from Dune that he defaults to on some of his projects. Not really the case in Bouncer. The Incal is basically Dune, the one that he never could do, but kind of revamped, as this huge epic with the mixture of science fiction and religion and mysticism. And in this one, from the get-go, you have, a planet. Well, it's not a planet; it's an island here that has a horrible environment. It's not sand; it's water that makes it unlivable. But they have a source of energy, like the spice in Dune, that can, get them, make them survive, or make them give them power in a way. But there is this regime that's controlling, and there's this kind of grotesque leader like Harkonnen in Dune, and then you have the powerful religious organization that's kind of
priest scientists,
exactly.
Yeah.
The Bene Gesserit in Dune, and then it was already in the Incal with what was it called in Incal? The techno priests in the Incal universe, and in this one, they look like cardinals. They're wearing the cardinal gowns. So I always have mixed feelings about that because he has done it many times, and I feel like he always has those crazy ideas, but sometimes it feels like we've heard them before. Whether it's from Dune or whether he's repeating himself. And sometimes, great artists do that. They kind of reshape an idea that they like in many different ways. And sometimes he succeeds to make it into something that is really new and interesting. And sometimes to me, it falls a little short of that. Now, that said, the saving grace of Moonface, to me, is Boucq. Because his work is absolutely amazing. It is worth the price of admission, definitely. And it's the control is composition, the way you can describe scenes that are monumental to very close up, draw any kind of crazy idea that Jodorowsky can have. Like, he probably told him, one thing I was talking to you about before we started the show is that Jodorowsky is very verbal, and he will instead of writing scripts, he will tell the story to his artists, and they take notes and draw storyboards. So you have to be very, very good and remembering what he said, and he will act out the different scenes and dance around the room. And I've heard Mobius talk about that, and I'm sure what happened with Boucq. He probably told him, and this big wave come crashing, and that's what 6 pages of the book. That, I mean, it could be really boring and visually, but it's just spectacular. It's really, really amazingly done. And I think that's what really drives and makes it, a page turner is to me is the artwork and invention, the way the pages are constructed and the different angles, the characters, the design. There's so much going on visually, so much invention to make that world really exist.
Now, it's interesting to hear you describe your experiences in reading Moonface because, I have to say one of my gaps in terms of comics reading experience is that I haven't yet read the Incal texts. I'm very much aware of them. It's something that I've been wanting to read for a while, but I just haven't taken the time to read the Incal, the various volumes. And how many volumes are there in the Incal series?
So the Incal series the main series is in 6 volumes.
Okay.
They are often, in the US, they're published in one book, but it's originally in 6. And the number 6 is very important. Jodorowsky is into tarot cards. If you go into tarot numbers and meanings, you can analyze the Incal through that. There's a lot of hidden stuff in it. Then he did, so that's with Mobius. Then he did before the Incal, another 6 volumes with another artist called Jean Getoff. And then he did after the Incal.
Right.
So that one, I think it has 2 or 3 volumes. One is by Mobius and another one is by Ladron, the Mexican artist, who is a Mobius clone. He's amazing. And then Final Incal, I think, is the last volume. But
the reason I mention this is because me not being familiar with Incal, I probably didn't have the same kind of experience that you did because, you mentioned earlier that it seems with Jodorowsky's narratives, for the most part, not, everything, for instance, not Bouncer, he seems to keep coming back to the same kind of story or the same elements of the story, which, you associated with his failed Dune project. But see, not knowing the Incal or the series of Incal narratives, I didn't get that sense that, here we have Jodorowsky revisiting things. So for me, it seemed to be fresh because I just wasn't familiar with the other stuff. Even though it's very wild, I can't underscore the wildness enough in terms of Moonface because I agree with you in that the big strength of Moonface is Boucq's art. And the story is exciting enough, but it seems to be meandering. In other words, there doesn't seem to be a clear trajectory. In hearing what you said about Jodorowsky dictating or speaking a script, that kind of makes sense because many of the things that happen in this deluxe edition of Moonface, they just seem to happen. It's almost like storytelling on a whim. It's like, okay, well, at this point, we got to bring in this group of revolutionaries, which are called, the swingniks. And then at another part, we need to bring in another group of people who are religious fanatics, who are dedicated to fishing. And there's this one creature, Teotihuacan, which is like a big whale.
Yes.
And so there's a big ceremony that goes on with that. And so that seems to almost come out of nowhere. And then we get the cathedral, and then we get the desert and turning the desert into a vegetated space. I mean, it just seems like, we have Moonface, Isha, and Lozbel being carried by seagulls across territory from the island that they're on, Damanustra, to this kind of desert territory. I mean, it just gets wild, just one thing after another that seem to be a series of narrative whims that Jodorowsky has.
Yeah, and you failed to mention that the fishermen are also their religion is around this brothel that has this strange ceremony where with the body of a young woman they found inside a whale, and they're trying to find somebody who can inseminate her. And then there is a very large lady who is the centerpiece of the brothel.
Oh God!
It has a very the aspect that Jodorowsky you can find in all of his work is this kind of grotesque carnival characters, and I think it's interesting, and it is something that he has explored in many different ways, and it can kind of turn off people, but the way he features grotesque or deformed characters in his stories is a constant theme, or self-mutilation is another thing. That's why probably he liked that part in Dune where Paul Atreides has to put his hand into a box and feel the pain and all that. The theme of self-mutilation, and we have it in this one with the whale. It's a kind of an interesting piece actually, that there is a scene of whale hunting. So the whale hunters are so excited. There's this huge whale coming, but because the sea is so polluted, the whale is half dead already. and so there is really no action. Like they throw their harpoons, but it's already pretty much dead. So they think, well, we can't come back like this, from a whale hunting and showing that no action happened. So they actually cut themselves and mutilate themselves. Like a guy cut his arm off to show that they fought the whale, to create.
Doesn't some guy gouge his eye out? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that theme of self-mutilation as a storytelling device is also something he has explored. He has a series that is called Aleph 2. It's about a young boy that is born without legs or hands. Sorry, no limbs at all. And the story is about how he magically finds his limbs. So the dismemberment throughout the 6 volumes, another 6-volume series. He always says, always in 6s. But so these are Jodorowsky's things that pop in.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned being born without limbs. This is eventually what happens to the conductor, right?
Oh, yes.
I mean, his demise is his having his various limbs cut off.
Yes.
And same thing with, I guess, his wife, Lily. Now, you mentioned the grotesqueness or the carnivalesque aspect of Jodorowsky's writing. Yeah, I mean, this is clear in, you mentioned the scene with the prostitute, that and her son, Serafino, who, when we first see him, and he's a hunchback.
Yes.
And when we first see him, he is the barker who is touting his mother, this very large woman who is a prostitute who basically has like 3
customers,
at least 3, men servicing her, 3 customers at one time. And so he is the one who is the barker, who is playing up his mother, and who is taking admission, right? Mm-hmm. So people are paying him in order to sleep with his mother. So, I mean, that fact in and of itself is rather grotesque. But then you see the characters themselves, right? Serafino and his hunchback, and then especially his mother. And then later on in the narrative, through some kind of joke, Serafino becomes a kind of Christ-like priest figure that everybody begins to follow. And then his mother, this really large naked prostitute, calls herself what, the holy whore or something like that. Yeah.
So,
it just gets wild.
Yes. And that's another theme that he's worked with many times. Like we see that in the Metabaron series, which is part of
that's something else I haven't read.
So there's they're called space. I can't remember the non-whores of space or something like this. There's always this female figure that is both religious and a prostitute. This dichotomy is something he plays with a lot. And I have to say, this book actually, in terms of themes, in terms of the environment, the impact of human activity on the environment, the absurdity of certain religious groups that he's making fun of, or also the ridiculousness of governments and the way they run. I mean, I think he's got some interesting things in there, right? But it's like a collection of ideas. Now, does it, and you have to go along, and then the visuals will take you. But it doesn't really lead you somewhere, right?
Right, and that gets back to something that I was mentioning earlier, the kind of meandering quality of this narrative. And so I think having all of these ideas, as you put it, that are out there, that are embedded in the text in one form or another, they're just there kind of in a scattershot way, not really congealing into, I guess, any kind of larger message or theme, which I think goes hand in hand with the way that the storytelling is conducted, which again seems kind of meandering, almost haphazard, going from one thing to another, from one event to a second to a third, and they don't necessarily have any kind of connective tissue.
Yeah, and maybe it's also emphasized this idea is because the lead character, Moonface, is a blank slate. He doesn't talk, or he can communicate through tying knots. He has this.
Yes, yeah. Another kind of like a cat's cradle, right? He has strings on his fingers. And
kind of a cool idea, and very well rendered visually. We have this big double-page spread of his hands playing with a string, and at other points he can take somebody's face, like if he touches you, and then because he has a kind of a blank face, almost like a smiley face in a way. And there's one point where Isha's face appears on his face, right? That's just one part in the story, but they don't really go back to this. And then further in the story, he can speak through people by holding their head, right?
Yeah.
So all these ideas that could be interesting and cool, but it is very.
So you're saying there's just not the kind of follow through that you would expect.
Yes, or you have to accept it for what it is. It's this ride, right? And you can feel the same with some of Mobius's books, like Airtight Garage, but this is what it is. It from the get-go they tell you this is improvised, right? Improvised comic storytelling. So it will meander and go in weird directions. Is kind of almost like a experimental book. But this one has such a unity and a quality of artwork and design and storytelling, visual storytelling, is so high. I almost feel, he put all this, all this work for those crazy ideas. You know what I mean? 12 years. It's a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, he's probably very fast as well. I don't know his technique, but because he was producing other stuff at the same time, which is quite amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the way that you described it in terms of improvisation makes a lot of sense, and so maybe you can call this jazz comics.
Yeah. Okay. Jazz delivers certain kind of maybe like very free jazz. I don't know, but maybe that's a good analogy. It's like a very crazy jazz conductor with the best musicians you can find, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can see.
Yeah, what I see in Jodorowsky is bebop.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
And, I think that our listeners may get the sense that we're talking about Jodorowsky's kind of improvisational type of storytelling in a negative way, but I mean, I don't know about you, Pascal. I don't mean that at all. I mean, it's just a different kind of storytelling, and something that you mentioned a second ago. You have to take it as it is, right? You have to take it on its own domain. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, then I think this will be a really interesting read. Mm-hmm. And you described it as a ride, and I think that that's a great way of looking at Moonface, because as I was reading this, I felt like I was on a ride, like a roller coaster. Mm-hmm. And it was a thrill to see where things led. At times things didn't make sense, but that's okay. I knew that I was just along for the ride. And if I sit back and try not to analyze it too much, that it can be a lot of fun. Oh, and I had a lot of fun reading this.
Yeah, there's also one thing we didn't mention is that a lot of it is humorous. A lot of it, it doesn't take itself too seriously. You shouldn't take it too seriously. It has a sense of fun and kind of outrageous fun that is with it. So, and I think it's and Jodorowsky's body of work has different types of books or movies, and some of them are in this style, and others maybe more structured, like Bouncer is definitely more traditional narrative with, like you said, beginning, middle, and end. Mm-hmm. And actually, when he starts this kind of story like Moonface, I think it's also, it's 12 years. He doesn't know they're gonna be doing this for 12 years. Maybe it will end with the first book. Maybe that would be 2 books, maybe 3. When I remember when it came out, it didn't say anywhere that it was, volume 1 of something. It just came out. It was called Moonface
Cathedral.
Actually, it was called the Wave Tamer. And then it was so that was Moonface, the Wave Tamer, and then the Invisible Cathedral. And then we just read this and thought it was great, and maybe there's going to be a second volume, and then came out. But 5 years later, and then finally the third. So, I mean, it's one thing we need to mention is the translation. I was very pleased with the effort that Montana Kane made to really show the different levels of speech between the different groups. Like, there are definitely different social groups, different factions, and they don't speak the same way. Like, there is definitely the upper class people who have this kind of more formal speech, and then kind of slangy English with the other groups, and it may not seem like much, but I think translation of comics, sometimes people don't go through that effort. And I know maybe it's maybe not the case with books that are translated nowadays from French to English, but for the longest time, stuff that was translated from the US to France, it was done in a way that was very flat. And then when I read, for even like a Marvel comic, when I read the language of Marvel comics, it was like, in English, it was like, oh my God. I mean, the Stan Lee voice, It wasn't there in the French one. It was very flat. It was like there was not like enough spelled UF and all that stuff. It wasn't there. It was very kind of bland. So I always appreciate it when the translator, really makes an effort to kind of show that it's different type of people speaking and they don't use the same kind of language. So.
Yeah, and again, the translator on this is the same translator as Hasib and the Queen of Serpents,
yes.
Montana Kane.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So good job, Montana.
Yes. And two really fascinating books that we discussed for July. We started off with David Bey's Hasib and the Queen of Serpents, A Tale of 1001 Nights. This came out in early June from NBM. And then later in June, the next book that we discussed, Moonface, written by Alejandro Jodorowsky with art by Faceis Boucq. And that's a Humanoids publication.
Yes. Gorgeous.
Definitely, yes, two gorgeous books that we highly recommend that you check out. And if you want to find great prices on translated works such as this, then check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you will find every single month incredible savings, great discounts that you can't beat. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can write to us by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. And if you want to reach me directly, you can email me at pascal@comicsalternative.com.
Or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And we're all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So please do let us know what you think about our Euro comic series. Pascal and I enjoy discussing these texts. And as we said, this may be coming out the first few days of August, but this is our July show. We will be back later in the month for our August episode. So listen up for that.
Definitely.
Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Pascal.
See you later.
Au revoir.